Okay, so I think we'll get started. It's 10 o'clock in the UK, 7 p.m. in Australia. Hi to everyone joining us from Australia. Also to colleagues joining us from Africa, Asia, the rest of Europe, and the Middle East. Good afternoon to you guys joining us today. I'd just like to do some quick introductions before we get started. Hopefully you should be able to see my slides and the title of today's webinar, Identifying Plagiarism in Student Work, which will be hosted by my colleague Wendy Sutherland-Smith. Hopefully you can see that, and you can also see our poll today, just to find out where you're joining us from. I'm just going to slightly turn up my volume. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. I'll turn this up slightly. Okay, we're at the max there. I'll try and speak a bit more loudly. Okay, so my name's Jill Rowell. I'm the academic advisor at Turnitin and Plagiarism Advice. This is the second of our series of webinars on the theme of fostering a culture of honesty and academic integrity. Some of us may have joined us for last week's webinar. The recordings of the webinars will all be on the website, that's plagiarismadvice.org, at a future date. So if you are having issues with this webinar, it will be recorded for future reference. The webinar series is really to cover general themes around plagiarism and addressing plagiarism and promoting academic integrity with students. And the webinars are supported by a series of tip sheets, which will also be available on the website. And I'll talk a little bit more about the tip sheet after Wendy's given her presentation and show you a little bit of that. The idea of the webinars is really to provide sort of real life examples around the theory of the tip sheets, if you like, and to provide anecdotes and experiences from people who are actually addressing plagiarism and academic integrity in the field, as it were. I'm just going to take this poll off there for you. Oh, there you go. Okay, the webinars are hosted by colleagues who have been working in these areas, and they're members of what we call our academic network, who are people who throughout the world have been addressing plagiarism in their practice, in their teaching. So they're practicing academics, they're people who are involved in promoting policy at their institution. Some of them will be from librarians, from the information management area. So a whole host of different colleagues from different locations around the world. Okay, so the format of the session will be Wendy's going to give her presentation for around 20 minutes or so. There will be the opportunity for you to put questions to Wendy. If you type your questions into the chat window, we'll collate them and put those to Wendy. Wendy does also have some questions for you, so there will be a little bit of interaction whilst we go through the session. So I'll just give a little introduction to Wendy. For those of you who've been working in this area, you probably will have come across Wendy's name. Like our colleague last week, Jude Carroll, Wendy has around 10 years of experience in this area. So she has quite considerable experience in addressing plagiarism, in looking at institutional policies and looking at assessment design. She's also the author of Plagiarism, the Internet and Student Learning, three topics which are certainly close to our heart for those of us who are working in this area. Her early career was in law, which has informed to some degree her thinking on plagiarism and academic integrity. Personally, I first heard Wendy speak in 2009 at a meeting in Oxford in the UK, and she gave a fascinating keynote on the retributive discourse in plagiarism management. So looking at the semiotics that we use for in plagiarism management, both from the institutional policy point of view and also in press and media, and how they actually refer to plagiarism. And Wendy might give a little bit of an insight to that during her presentation. Her focus has primarily been on looking at institutional policy for academic integrity and plagiarism, and also looking at collusion, which I know from my personal experience, this is an area where a lot of students struggle with perceptions of what's acceptable and what's unacceptable in terms of group work and working with their fellow students. So this is something where students will often look to their institutional policy for guidance. Wendy's currently the Director of Teaching and Learning in the School of Psychology at Deakin University in Australia, and she has responsibility for pedagogy and quality improvement. We're very grateful for Wendy to join us today. It is obviously early evening in Australia, so she is giving up her spare time to be with us today. So I'm going to pass over to Wendy now, and she's going to load her slides up into the window and talk through those. Take it away, Wendy.
Thanks, Jill.
Just be a second while Wendy switches the slides over.
Hopefully all of you can see those slides. If not, please type a message in there and Jill will do what she can. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear as well. And good evening and afternoon and morning to all of you from around the world. As Jill has said, I've been working in plagiarism since the late 1990s, and so I hope some of my experience in this area will help you. I have 14 slides. The last two are about resources that I hope you'll find useful. Some of them websites, some of them articles, some of them books, etc. And I've tried to just keep things in there that are very recent. So, you know, I hope you'll find those useful. There will be two opportunities to ask questions. So there'll be one after about slide 4 and then towards the end. So before I start talking about detecting plagiarism in student work, Jill, I wonder if you could just put up the first poll for me, please. So folks, if you could just give me some idea about policy, and I'll talk to you about why policy is so important in the next couple of slides in terms of the detection of plagiarism. So I won't speak while you're doing that, and if everyone can have a little bit of a vote, that'd be great. Okay, we all done? All right, so obviously most of you do, and some of you are unsure. And that's actually quite normal, quite standard, that some people are unsure about the policy, or if you have one, where it's actually to be found. So Jill, I think there was another question there. Okay, as those votes are coming through, it's really interesting that, you know, it seems as though 41% of you are unsure about whether your policy is contingent upon intention or not. And in the next 3 slides, again, I'll talk to you about why that's been so important. And a lot of my previous research has been about the intentionality or not of plagiarism, and a lot of the universities around the world now are moving away from intention as an indicator, but there is still very strong moves in some areas that base plagiarism upon notions of whether you intended to gain an unfair advantage or not. Yes, there's sort of, you know, it's pretty close between yes and no, and then there's quite a few who are unsure. So might I suggest to you that for those of you who are unsure, to actually go back and have a look at your policy, and if it's not clear from there, then that's a conversation that you need to be having in your institutions, no matter whether they're universities, colleges, schools. That's a conversation that has to happen. Is there another question there, Jill? Okay, so in terms of are you familiar with the procedure you have to follow, most of you really are, and there's a few who are not. Again, that's quite common, and be aware that if you're an institution and you're in one for a long time, that plagiarism policies are sort of like, you know, socks really. They get changed quite a bit. And certainly here in Australia, after a rather large scandal that occurred in 2002, every university in this country scrambled to change their plagiarism policies. So just be aware that when there's a change of policy, or you know, if there's a new quality assurance team operating at the executive level, sometimes there can be a change in procedure as well. So just so long as you're sure that you know what your rights and responsibilities are, that'd be great. Jill, anything else? Yeah, and I think this is really something that's problematic for all of us who teach, is that a lot of institutions will say, please direct your students to the plagiarism policy, please make sure that they're aware what it says, etc. But from that, 65% of you, or 63% of you, say that it's easy for the students to find it, and then there's 36% who say it's not easy. Or if it's easy to find, can they actually understand it or read it is a supplementary question. So again, these are things that you can take back to the institutional executive and just say, well, you know, it's great, but if you type plagiarism policy into the institutional website, what comes up? And I think that's a fairly good measure of whether, if somebody wanted to know what plagiarism was in your institution, if you can find it by typing in plagiarism policy and it comes up straight away with what the policy is and how the process works, then I think that's how it should be. Okay, thanks, Jill. If you could just close those polls. Thank you, people. I will hopefully put you to the next slide. Let me see. Okay, so the reason that I know this might seem a strange place to start, but I really want to show you that it's important to know what your institution says in terms of how you determine what plagiarism will be. And these are some of the things that occur within the policy regime of plagiarism, if you like. Some institutions put plagiarism under academic misconduct. A lot of them do. Others put it under academic honesty, academic integrity, have it as a much more positive kind of way of trying to get integrity and those sorts of things within the system. Others look at intention to deceive or gain unfair advantage, and therefore for those kinds of policies, intention is a crucial factor. Did you intend to deceive or not? If you didn't intend to deceive, then maybe it's not plagiarism, it may well be something else. Others have got zero tolerance, which means intention is irrelevant. The policy says, if we find it and you're found guilty, that's it. There's no second chances, there's no let's talk about it, it's, you know, there's nowhere else to go, that's it. And the that's it can be something serious like you're immediately expelled from the institution, or you can no longer complete that course, or you're suspended from units for 12 months, or whatever. So the ramifications of the way in which the institution sees plagiarism is really quite huge in terms of, you know, how staff handle it, and also obviously for students. Also, is plagiarism seen as cheating or something of a lesser act? And again, I'll show you in policy where this is deemed to be the case. And importantly for you, for your own protection, do you know what to do once you detect it? Do you know what you have to do then? What are the next steps? So, I'd like to just run you through some institutional examples of plagiarism. The first one is from my own university, where if you look at the definition of plagiarism, and Jude talked about definitions last week a bit and gave us a sort of a continuum of definition of plagiarism, there's nothing in there that talks about intention in this particular institution. However, when it comes to the offence, as it's classified in misconduct in our university, if you come to collusion, there is a very clear intent of obtaining advantage with fraudulent purpose there. So there's a clear area of intent there. So if you were from a background in law, like I am, I would read that policy and say, okay, so if I'm going to be guilty of collusion, then that means that I intend to obtain an unfair advantage by using the work of somebody else when I submit my assignment. But it doesn't say that in plagiarism, so maybe intention is irrelevant. It's not really clear. It doesn't say intention has to be there, but it doesn't say that it doesn't either. If we look at another institution, Washington University, this is an example of a sort of zero tolerance, where if you've used it, then you're guilty of cheating. And it's seen very much in the ambit of cheating, and guilt. So these are very much, as I've written about a lot, sort of the areas of criminal law. Now, the University of Washington does have a number of different outcomes for that. Interestingly, some of our colleagues in Sweden, where there is a kind of a national way of looking at cheating under SFS 100, what happens there is that if a student is has an allegation of plagiarism put against them, then the teachers have very little room to manoeuvre, because there's not a whole range of things that can happen as a result of that. So, you know, it's quite tricky for teachers to sort of mediate what happens, and very difficult for some of our colleagues to make the decision as to whether they decide they will pursue an allegation of plagiarism or not. If I take you to the next policy, the reason that this one is interesting from Monash is that although it talks about plagiarism as an academic act of misconduct, under the procedures policy, it says that if the acknowledgement of ideas of others was not intentional, then the only offence the student has committed is the academic misdemeanour of failing to reference a source correctly, and you can still get academic penalties. So here is a policy that says intention is the key decider whether you have got a case of plagiarism or you've got a case of academic misdemeanour of failing to reference sightly, which is correctly, which is a much, much lesser offence, and the penalties are far, far less severe. So there's an institution where intention and how you look at plagiarism as an intentional act or not is the key decider. And all of the research from myself and many of my colleagues around the world show that how people interpret intention is a very subjective thing. And myself and others have written extensively how software cannot actually tell you about intention. It can text match, which is very helpful, and I'll show you an example from, unfortunately, one of my own PhD students in the last 2 weeks, how the software indeed assisted me. But, you know, keep very clearly in mind that if you're going to be using software, then the software will provide text matching. It will not tell you if plagiarism has occurred, and it doesn't matter what the software is. The call on detecting plagiarism is a human one, and it's a subjective one. So I think that's where discussion needs to take place in various institutions. So I'd just like to stop there for a second, Jill, and see whether there's any kinds of questions that people would have at this point on what I've said so far.
Hi, Wendy. A lot of people have been talking about the actual policy and where it exists in their institution. I'm just going to put my webcam on so you can see me. So people talking about, you know, the policy might exist, but it's hidden in the student handbook. Only the plagiarism declaration is visible. And the plagiarism policy and the declaration might be available centrally, but students might not be aware of that. So quite a few comments around that. One question from Carol, she's asking about how your policy, or how policies in general, might deal with self-plagiarism.
Interesting question. I don't think a lot of policies for the students talk about self-plagiarism at all. Some of them may talk about it in terms of academics, and that's a whole realm that we're not really going to talk about today. We're more interested in student plagiarism rather than academics plagiarising themselves. But I can tell you that a lot of conferences and a lot of places now will run academic work through some kind of a software checker to see whether you've actually given that conference presentation before or whether you've published it in a journal before, etc. So the whole idea of self-plagiarism isn't really addressed in any policy. I think it's assumed that you don't plagiarise yourself, but it's not stated as such. So it's an interesting question, one to which there's no clear answer. I haven't seen a policy that talks about if a student has submitted this kind of work in one unit and it talks about X and Y and Z in such and such an essay, you cannot use the data or you cannot use the material from that unit in another unit. I've never seen a policy like that. I'm happy to be corrected by others who may have, but that's my experience.
Okay, I have actually seen policies like that in the UK. You know, certainly about, you know, substantial work that has already been assessed can't actually be submitted for assessment again. So I have seen that in some policies in the UK. I don't know whether it's unique to the UK.
Yeah, Jill, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I certainly haven't seen terribly much here. I mean, there's certainly stuff that talks about in various units, and I'm talking about policies at the central university level. There's certainly stuff placed in the unit guides of discipline-specific units that say to students, if you've done this in Psych 1, then you can't do it in Psych 201. You know, there's stuff at the unit level, but at the central university level, you know, sometimes not so much. Yeah, so that's on self-plagiarism. I did see a question asking about the difference between academic integrity and academic honesty, I think. Yeah. Look, it's interesting because academic integrity, I think, is a much bigger thing. It's sort of like the umbrella or the ballpark kind of thing, term. I think they're used interchangeably. Often people talk about academic honesty and academic integrity as the same thing. The reason I think academic integrity is a bigger thing is sometimes you get, in terms of that, you get a research ethics. So research ethics committees will talk about academic integrity in terms of how a research project is put up, or certain processes that might happen ethically or not ethically, whereas a lot of the time academic honesty seems to become that much more in terms of the student product, whether that's written product or it's choreography. It's the accessible product that students do in terms of the assessment that they're asked to do. So again, it's possibly different for other places, but that's sort of the way that I've seen it play out.
Just a couple of comments, Wendy, on intent. You know, saying, isn't intent very difficult to prove? And certainly from research that I've done on intent in institutional policies, where I've actually, when people have said, then, you know, intent is included in their policy, and I've actually gone back to people and said, well, how do you actually prove intent in practice? They found that quite difficult, very difficult to actually you know, prove it, you know, in terms of students' actual written work. Do you have any pointers about how you can actually prove intent?
I think intention is really fraught with difficulty. I think intention is subjective. Again, I go back to my intellectual home of the law, and in terms of intention, you would look for factual display of somebody's intent. So you would look for example, how much of the piece of work is plagiarised. If it's 90%, it's possibly difficult for a student to run the argument that they didn't know, they made a mistake, they dropped off a few references, etc. So you know, you would look at how much. You would look at what kind of plagiarism. So, for example, one of the things that I see happening that I think is really hard is for students who are quoting lecturers' lecture slides back to them in the written piece of assessment, or they're quoting something from a recorded lecture back to a lecturer in part of their written assessment, and they're saying that, you know, this is what you said, and because it's out there with all of the student body, it's common knowledge. And it comes back again to that discussion of last week about what is common knowledge. Now, a lot of academics will turn around and say, please don't quote me back to me. I regard that as plagiarism. Please don't include the stuff on my slides as part of your work. That's just part of the intellectual discussion, and I expect you to move on from that. But others don't. And so there can be a degree of, you know, confusion for students about what they can and what they can't use. But in terms of intent, if there was, you know, like a student gave me an assessment that had a whole lot of the stuff that I'd said back to them, you know, I'd sort of say, well, you know, I'm not really sure. But look, I agree with people. Intention is very, very difficult, I think, to prove, particularly if your procedures do not allow you to speak to the student. And in some cases, there are policies where once if you think you've detected it, it then moves on to another set of humans or a panel to deal with it. So you don't actually get to talk to the student and say, I'm not really clear about what you mean here. Could you tell me about it? Could you walk me through this? And where I've been in institutions where you can speak to the student, I think you can clear up 90% of those cases and you know, take action at that level, at the level of unit chair, dealing with your own discipline in you know, the appropriate way. Where that's not permitted, where it does have to actually go before a disciplinary group or something, I think that's much more difficult. And I can see some feeds here about how often do people reference their slides, etc. Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, how guilty are people about not putting references on the bottom of their slides? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Was there anything else, Jill? Sure. Okay. There was just a second poll there, Jill, asking people about the relationship between teaching and plagiarism. If you could just pop that up. Okay. I seem to have lost Jill and the poll. I have got Irfan that I can see, but I can't see Jill anymore, and I can't see the poll. From what I could see of the poll, a lot of people were saying yes, there's a strong link. What I would like to show is a slide that comes from a lot of my own research, where I do tend to argue that there's quite a strong correlation between teaching approaches and approaches to plagiarism within institutions. And again, I put this up merely as an extension in some ways to what Jude was talking about last week in terms of the continuum of plagiarism. This is a sort of I guess a mash together of approaches to teaching which can, in some ways, not necessarily, I hate to use the word encourage, but can allow perhaps students to get the wrong idea. So I hope everyone can see that that particular diagram. But at the top, where it's got teaching approaches, and again it's fairly bald, but in terms of transmissive approaches, which is again that very sort of instrumental stage on the stage. One of my favourite examples is a research project I did where I sat in a lecture theatre on a Friday from, I think it was 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock every Friday in the same lecture theatre, and it was anyone who used that lecture theatre. Interestingly, it was used by people from all over very many different disciplines: engineering, psychology, arts, humanities, science, medicine. It was a whole lot of different people who came in to deliver the lectures. Interestingly, nobody ever picked up that I actually wasn't one of their students, and you know that may not be surprising in a lecture theatre of 100 or 200, but considering I was there for 5 weeks, I thought that was pretty interesting. One of the things that struck me was, and I watched the students while lecturers were lecturing, and just to see what they were doing. I remember this one particular lecturer in a field where in a 1 hour lecture, the person put up 64 slides. So in that 1 hour, what those students did was furiously copy everything he had on those slides, because the slides were not available after the lecture. So the students in that particular 12-week semester unit would be very, very familiar with the idea that what the sage on the stage says is stuff that we have to copy down. So what do they then do with the copying that they've done? Do they then give it back to the lecturer in the written assessment? Do they reference the lecture, etc.? It was very, very interesting. So I think in that sort of environment where there's a lot of transmissive teaching, where there's a lot of talk, and the idea is that I talk and you copy, I wonder whether that's encouraging what I tend to call a culture of copying. Distinct from that is the other side, where there's transformative approaches to teaching, which is more about engagement and inquiry by the students and the teachers as one, inquiring into a unit. So it's a different form of teaching. There's usually a lot more engagement. Students in our units might use clickers, they might answer polls, there might be a roving microphone, there might be students sent off to do small group work within a giant lecture. And what I'm talking about here is, we have, for example, in a first year psych unit, we have 2,000 students on campus and off campus. So, dealing with those large kinds of numbers, getting interaction is difficult, but our staff work very hard to try and do that and to make it an engaging experience. And I think that sort of marries into approaches to plagiarism, where you've got very sort of legal notions of it's deliberate, it's calculated, there's punishment, it's misconduct, there's no second go, often leads from wondering about that culture of copying kind of approach. And unintentional plagiarism tends to look at sort of more what's the reason behind this, what's going on, what degree of the text, was it the student didn't know, is it the policy's not clear, is it that the student said, oh, I didn't realise that the lecturer didn't want me to tell the lecturer everything that they'd already said. I thought that from where I come from, it's really respectful for me to actually give the sage on the stage the words and the readings back to them as they were writ. So again, there's sort of a little bit more murkiness there. So I just offer that as a way to perhaps thinking about how we might look at our teaching before we get really sort of into punishing students for plagiarising, how we might look at what's going on in classrooms and tutorial rooms, etc., to see whether there's sort of this idea of culture of copying that comes from that. What I'd like to do is to move into what I see as 5 kinds of triggers for detection. And I've grouped it in these 5 ways, and I'd like to show you some slides on each. So I think in terms of your actual detection, once you've got your policy straightened out and you know what your responsibilities are and how your university views plagiarism, I think there's sort of the mechanical things. That's things like spelling, grammar, the document layout itself, style and font changes. You know, it's amazing sometimes students submit work where they've cut and pasted from the internet and they haven't even done the very simple step of going through the select all, make everything the same font and make it all the same size and all the same colour. So, you know, there's those kinds of the mechanics of the text, I think, which is one way of detecting copying that's happening. Some of it is about the referencing itself, particularly if in your discipline area very old sources are used and you haven't had those sources as part of an inclusion of core readings. So, for example, a friend of mine who teaches in the area of educational philosophy says, of course I talk about Plato, of course I talk about these other things, and, you know, of course they're, you know, from old, in inverted commas, kinds of sources. But where those are part of your core readings or the sorts of things you're doing all the time, I think, you know, that's fine. But where you know that you're perhaps working in IT or you're working in an area that changes a great deal all the time, and many of our disciplines do, when people are dragging out old sources, and I think again of law, where you might drag out an old case and you think, well, there was a High Court decision on that, you know, only 5 years ago, which changed the whole way that it worked there. So you become a little bit suspicious about the old sources. Some of them use strange references, overuse of websites, and particularly for me, where, like many of us who teach, you're very, very careful in your planning about what you want the students to read, what you've asked them to be core of the sort of intellectual engagement that they have in the unit. So you include a set of core readings or set texts. Now, where those aren't really mentioned in student work, and you've asked them to use references and you've asked them to refer to, you know, the materials in the unit, that to me is immediately suspicious, particularly if week after week you've been hammering on about this is a key reading, this is a really seminal paper in this area, and a student doesn't even give it a glancing reference. To me, that's something I go and check. Either they're perhaps, you know, lazy and haven't read it, or there's other forces at work here. So the referencing, I think, is a second trigger. I think in terms of, and I will talk a little bit about contract cheating, which came up last week. I think where you've set a topic and you get a very generic-y kind of response from the student that sort of maybe on a good day, if all the planets were aligned, you might think answers the question. But it's actually not contextual. It's not specific to the thing that you've asked. So, for example, if you set a question that was asking about a particular kind of managing or marketing approach that was happening in, New Zealand or Australia or somewhere, and you're asking a specific thing, and you get a very generic-y kind of answer that doesn't seem to address the practices that would be happening in those particular national contexts. To me, that sounds more like something that's come from somewhere else. And I would be looking to check that and check the students' understanding of that. And again, I come back to the policy of the institution and whether you are in a position where you can call the student and say, very interesting response. I'm wondering what, for example, if you're looking in the Australian context, I'm wondering how if you're going from a small business to a public company, what do you make of, the corporation's law regulations on that? And so you actually try and nail them down with specifics about the question. You may not be in a position to do that, or it may not be possible, but I've done that with on-campus and off-campus students to try and figure out what's going on with those really generic, pseudo answers. I think the fourth trigger for me is discourse, and this is where I've put gut feeling and hunch in there, because you just get this gut feeling as you're reading it that it's just not quite right, and you're not really sure that you can pin it down to anything specific, but you just get a feeling. Things like changes in the language. There's all of a sudden this beautiful fluid passage, and then it gets into something that's quite clunky, and you think, wow, that's a real change in style. I wonder why. You recognise prior phrases. So I remember actually grading a whole set of student work where even there was an example that was used, and it was in the area of educational discourse, and it was about students talking about how PE students in year 12, our last year of secondary school here, how PE students talk about something, and I thought, that's a really weird example to use. And I came across two students, like 15, 20, 30 papers apart, that used the same example. And you go, I'm sure I've read that somewhere else. And we've all had that, I'm sure I've read that somewhere else. And then that's when you start to go back. And when I did go back and check, I think there was something like 50 words that were different between the two things. So I just went through and I highlighted everything that was the same in both papers and called both students in and said, okay, what's going on? And one student admitted that he had asked the other student for a copy to look at, which is a common thing. Oh, can I just have a look at yours? I'm not quite sure what to do. And a lot of well-meaning students will email it to someone else, and then that person doesn't behave appropriately. So, you'll see those phrases that you go, I've read this before, and your gut feeling is usually right. Go with it. Sometimes the vocabulary is way too sophisticated for the unit or the level, and again, that whole discourse, the whole language that's used, you get a gut feeling about it, and I say go with that. The fifth trigger for me is a text match, and again, electronic, any of those things, it does give you a text match. It's not detection of plagiarism, it is a text match, and that can be very helpful as well. So there's sort of 5 broad triggers for me for plagiarism, and let me just show you some examples, if I may. The first one is a case where in the green, you've got that different style of referencing. So the student has been completely and utterly inconsistent with referencing. Now, to me, that suggests that perhaps they may well be very unfamiliar with it, but you think that they'd try and use the same thing all the way through. To me, where you've got in the first bit after women's voices and you've got it as a footnote, and secondly, you've got, and I'm looking at the green, after Foucault, 1980, and then you've got a footnote again, and you've got a completely different way of referencing that down the bottom with Christian names. You've got some of that's at Harvard. You've got a whole mishmash there. To me, that sort of looks a little bit like maybe there's been a bit of cutting and pasting going on. And I would be, because I'm very, very clear with students about, in this particular unit, and you may have specific guidelines that say we only use footnoting. Like in law, that's what we use. in this unit we use footnoting. In others, look, I don't care what you use, but just use the same thing. You know, just use the one thing. If you use Harvard, use Harvard. If you use APA, use APA. But, you know, use the one thing. So this to me looks a little bit like cut and paste. In terms of the yellow there, they're sort of words that we wouldn't necessarily use a lot here in Australia, or the spelling's a little bit different. So it suggests to me that someone's gone to US sites. So when you talk about college, in Australia we tend not to talk about colleges. We talk about universities or high schools. So again, with graduate students, we talk about postgraduate or undergraduate. Raise up is, you know, again, something that I wouldn't necessarily think is quite right. And the spelling of colour, in this particular unit, we were quite clear that we wanted UK Australian kind of spellings. So again, that's a US spelling, which we specifically said we want this kind of spelling. So, you know, I think those sorts of things are, you know, things that you would pick up. When you look at the light blue, where it says you wouldn't be able to vote or play sports, and then there's a whole new paragraph for one sentence. Contraception would be illegal, a whole new paragraph for another sentence. You would be expected to marry. To me, that's classic cutting and pasting from a web, because often those very short, sharp things, that's the way it's set out. And normally an academic paragraph wouldn't be okay to have one sentence. It might be if you're working in poetry or in other things where you've allowed some kind of a different way of setting it out. But for me, for an academic essay, I wouldn't accept a paragraph as being one sentence. So to me, that again is a trigger to say this has been cut and pasted from somewhere. If you look at the kind of language there, contraception would be illegal. You wouldn't be able to vote. Again, you've got would not, you've got wouldn't. Then you look at, but Foucault, genealogies of power knowledge challenge traditional ways of thinking about power. That's a whole different discourse style. And to me, that's been cut and pasted, because the student hasn't spoken like that anywhere else. They've got a quote from Evelyn Reed down the bottom, which is much more like that kind of language. But where you're going from you wouldn't be able to vote to genealogies of power and knowledge, to me that's not the same student speaking. Now the student might have meant to put that in quotation marks. I strongly suspect that's the case, but it didn't happen. So these are the sort of mechanical things that stand out to me as triggers for looking at the text. In this case, this is unfortunately a couple of weeks ago one of my PhD students, and when it's that, I would urge you to try and avoid the feelings that you might get of taking it personally. It's not. I don't think it's actually intended to hurt you personally, but it's disappointing when you find it. This. You can see in the contrast here that the language on the right is the student speaking, and is speaking clearly about her personal experience of this area. This is an area where this particular PhD student is writing in a number of areas, and this area is she's talking about some feminist theory, which is not my area of expertise. It is one of my associate supervisors' areas of expertise. So this is not my gig at all. But my associate supervisor picked it up, and you know, I'll show you what we did. But where you look on the left-hand side, it's very clear that you're talking where a student, and these were not in quotation marks. A student says the problem with this dyadic account of women's subordination, and flip down to the next underlined bit, women's subordination in contemporary Western societies, feminists will have to move beyond the master-subject model to analyse how women's subordination is secured through cultural norms, social practices and other impersonal structural mechanisms. This is a very sophisticated way of putting things together. It does suggest that there's some understanding of whatever this master subject model is in feminist theory. It suggests there's some kind of understanding of roles of subordination, etc. If you contrast that to the language on the right, there's a very clear change in the discourse. And again, to me, where there's such a contrast in the discourse, that was something, because it's not my area, that I did choose to run it through some software, and I'll just show you the results of that. Our university does use Turnitin, and I did use Turnitin to run it through. And as you can see there, that's the final report that you get. Of the 35% of internet sources, the student had gone to the one in Leeds for 20% of the time. So I went to that site, I checked it out, and a lot of, there were 10 of the 15 pages were pretty much cut and pasted from this particular site. Where you've got at number 5 and number 11, which I've just highlighted there, there's 1%, it's in others as well, but there's 1% where it says student paper. Now that may mean that the student, there's been another student who has also gone to that site and written those same words, which has gone into the Turnitin database, so that it doesn't necessarily mean that this student has copied from another student paper. It just means that it's been matched through the Turnitin database, so that there could be other students who've also taken from clearly this very well written part of an internet site. So that sort of was I guess the final report and what alerted me to take this further. I just wanted to show you a small sample of how the report came back. And I hope that that's loud enough. That's just a screenshot of the actual matching capability. One of the reasons that I do tend to run it through Turnitin sometimes is that I get the colour coding. So that helps me locate where things have come from. So you can see in that top green bit, the student has put the occasional word which is in the black text, things like notice, through, put in a reference, put in analyzers, but the majority of that has been taken from the site that's got the arrow from the left. 27% match came from that website I told you about before, and again you can see here where the student hasn't used quotation marks to differentiate them taking something and saying, look, I understand this is somebody else's words, but I'm talking about the relations of power here, and this person says it very, very well in these ways. So I think this is very helpful, and we have since used with the student to get a rewrite on this particular area. Contract cheating was something that was talked about or raised a little bit last week, and I'd just like to talk briefly about that. I would really, really recommend that you go to Tom Lancaster and Robert Clark's recent work on contract cheating. I've put the website down there, and I've also put it in the list of resources at the end. I think you've got to be proactive rather than reactive, and I think contract cheating is largely allowed, and I do not want to step on Mike Reddy's territory because he will be talking about assessment next week, I believe, but it's around assessment tasks that are authentic, they're context or location specific, they involve the key readings that you set, they involve the class discussions or presentations that you have going on in your area, so that really it's something that's very, very difficult for students to outsource to somebody who hasn't been involved in your unit that you're running and you're teaching. I think that's to me is the key, is having those assessment tasks designed in such a way that it makes it really, really difficult for students to actually buy in generic product. I don't think you should be afraid of asking students to explain things, particularly if it's suspicious it's been purchased. I've rung up off-campus students, I've used Skype, I've had students in the office as well. So I don't think it really matters what kind of location your students are in. I think it's possible to talk to them about, that was a really interesting case that you brought out. How did you come up with that? Because it's really, out of left field. I'm interested in how you relate that to our class readings, that sort of thing. Look, I'm really curious about this rather than I think that you're doing X, Y, and Z. I think there's ways to approach it that make it much easier for students to actually have the opportunity or feel like they have the opportunity to explain. I often use oral component, whether it's oral assessment, to check student understanding, whether that's, in your face-to-face wandering around the tubes, whether that's actually an oral assessment task. And I've done that in large off-campus units as well. I think that there's that opportunity. It's much less likely that they're going to try and run something past you if it's some kind of a conversation, an oral assessment in which you're engaged in the conversation. I also run it through software. So, contract cheating did come up. I do think it's an issue that we have to deal with, but I think it comes much more down to our assessment, and I'm sure Mike Reddy will might talk about it last week. Of course, you can ask for students to provide you with working drafts, etc., etc. I know that a lot of my colleagues who teach units that have got very large numbers of students don't like to do that because then they feel obliged to look at them all. And where you've got 2,000 students in a unit, it's not possible necessarily to go through a lot of drafts. And also the school won't pay for that kind of level of assessment. But yeah, I'm happy to take questions on that. So if you suspect it, what do? Again, please make sure that you're acting within your institutional policy procedures. You might think it's plagiarism, but if your institution doesn't define it the way you do, you leave yourself open. So it's really important to know that you're acting within the protocols of your institution. Do you confront the student? Do you take it to the unit chair, the head of department, have it for a third party? Do you have an academic conduct officer? What documentation do you need to prepare? How does the documentation go? Does the student get to see it? Do you speak to the student? All of these things are things that you need to know. What is your responsibility? What are the processes and procedures that you follow to be fair, protect yourself, but also to be fair to the student and make sure that you're acting within the correct guidelines. I just, before I take any further questions, just like to run just to the last two slides. I've tried to put, and these will be available to you, obviously, I've tried to put them in two. How do you detect and the sort of the policy kinds of things? I've used websites there. They've got lots and lots of resources, lots of student self-evaluation things, lots of online tutors, lots of information that you can download. That's the first one. And the second one is about language and textuality and some of the, again, hopefully more recent things that have been published in that area. So Jill, I'll pass it over to you if there are any questions.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm just going to start my webcam back on so you can see. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to pick up on a few things that came up while you were speaking. A couple of things. Someone asked, what about if a gut feeling tells me that a student has plagiarized, but there's no evidence in place? What do you do there?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. If your gut feeling tells you, then you're probably right. If you're in the position where you are actually able to speak to the student, I would ask them. I would say, look, I'm really interested in where this idea comes from, or where this kind of stuff has been evidenced, or we haven't really talked about this. Where does that come from? So if you're in the position where you can actually speak to the student, that's what I would do. If you're not and you can't find evidence, I would perhaps make a note. I would perhaps, if it's possible, take it to a unit coordinator or your head of teaching and learning, if you have a body like that, and just say, look, I'm a little concerned about how this student's tracking. It may be a whole lot of your colleagues are finding the same thing, in which case that's something where perhaps the student can be called in and asked to explain, across a number of units. It might not just be you.
Okay, another point from Carol, asking about anonymous marking, if you have a policy of anonymous marking, and perhaps how you would be able to detect plagiarism in those cases. I'm thinking, she's maybe thinking about how, you shouldn't really be determining this is by a particular student, that, if you do have a policy of anonymous marking. I suppose that might be where, software could help you.
Yeah, look, if it's anonymous marking, then all you do is that if you suspect it and you pick it up, is that you put it back to whoever the unit chair is, who will obviously be able to match up, or head of department, whoever the person in charge of that particular unit is, because they should then follow that up. Because obviously, if you've got some kind of anonymity involved, somebody has to somewhere match up whatever that paper is with a student. So there has to be somebody somewhere in the institution, if it's exams or somebody has to be responsible for this. And I would think it's the unit chair or the person in charge of the unit, even if it's exams.
And just quickly, Steve touched upon something that I know a little bit about different models of using Turnitin, and about how if you're using a model where you are only putting suspicious pieces of work through the software, are you singling out students there? And maybe you should be using a model where you're putting all students' work through there, so that you're not identifying potential plagiarism, but all students are being treated the same. Do you have any guidance on that, Wendy?
Yeah. Well, at this particular university, academic staff have to ask for access to Turnitin. What we do is we actually ask the students to run it through, so that they can run it through as drafts, and we ask them to provide the reports for us. Where I've put it through is for postgraduate students. That's where I've sort of had suspicions. So actually, the way that this university uses the software is to give all the responsibility and power to the students and say, you need to be sure that what you're giving us is your own work. And look, yes, I know that in the process of running it through draft after draft, students can change every fifth word or whatever. I know that there are some students who can use techniques to try and overcome the ideal of the system. Unfortunately, if those students actually put the time into writing the wretched thing instead of taking all these shortcuts to try and confound the system, they would have written a really good thing. But, they're very, very small in percentage. And a lot of students will go, oh, I forgot to put that quote in. I forgot to put quotation marks around that. I forgot to reference that. So I truly believe the majority of students do the right thing.
And just one final point, as we're running slightly over time. There was a little bit of discussion, and this is something I get asked a lot about, tolerance levels for Turnitin, about setting thresholds. Can you set a threshold? Can you definitively say all work below this particular threshold is plagiarism free, and everything above this threshold is suspect? Can you do that?
No, I don't think you can. I don't think universities, and I can't speak for secondary schools or colleges, but I don't think you can say everything above 30% is plagiarism, everything below that is not. It depends. It can be very discipline specific. So, for example, if you had something in science where a lab report went through and it came up as 15%, that might be incredibly significant, because there's so much of that lab report that is very tightly moulded, that there's not that much room to manoeuvre. So the 15% might be, in equivalent terms for another discipline, almost 100% of the student actually doing some kind of reflection or some kind of comment on the work. So, I don't think you can. Yeah.